became a Sunday Times bestseller and was named Book of the Year by The Times, Spectator and Observer. In its 2022 reprint, this book has been renamed with the subtitle Gender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights, the topic she will speak to tonight. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been great to meet people over here and find that my words travel to halfway around the world and that they also influence people and have affected people here too. When you write, you're like someone who puts words, like a little message in a bottle and sends it out because you're sitting on your own at home. You don't know what's going to land and what it's going to turn into. But 4 years later, there are people who are still telling you about it, and it's really quite meaningful. So, we all know what it is, but let's start by defining trans ideology. It's very simple. It's the belief that being a man or a woman is something other than male or female. It's a matter of self-declaration, not objective biology. Such a simple idea, and wrong. And straight away, when you realise that that's all it is, you understand that the way that it's talked about in wider society a lot of the time is wrong. Because people talk about trans as if there's a special sort of person who's trans, that it's a characteristic of people, like being gay or being black or being an adult. Or they say fully transitioned, but they don't actually know what they mean by that. Or they say living as a woman. Well, just get up and go about my day. You know, is that living as a woman? Yes, because I'm a woman, but I'm not doing anything to it. In fact, all it is just saying you're trans. It's just linguistic. A trans person is just a person who says there's trans. A trans woman is just a man who says he's a woman, and that's all. And understanding that is essential to fighting it. Well, people get into this in lots of different ways. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people by now have told me how they got into it, and the most common ones are they're worried about children, or they noticed sport. And then, of course, there's a significant number who care about women's rights in there. So I was not any of those. My issue was logic. If you say that trans women are women, it's a circular definition. That's a definition in which you use the word that you're trying to define in the definition, so it doesn't define anything. If trans women are women, then the word women doesn't actually narrow you down at all from human being. And I thought, as soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, that's going to be interesting. Like, that surely is going to matter for situations where you actually have to make a distinction between men and women. And I was asked to write an article about why children were identifying as trans by The Economist's editor, and, you know, I noticed this. I hadn't actually heard of such a phenomenon myself. I hadn't come across it at all. My PhD was in mathematics. I hadn't had any knowledge at university of any of this stuff. I'd never heard of Judith Butler, so, you know, you can imagine when I started reading in 2017, this was good as I found. So I started to do what journalists do, which is just to, you know, ring people. So I rang the press office at Stonewall, or maybe I emailed them, I can't remember, and said, I can see that you're supporting gender self-ID. I'm just a bit worried that that might have an impact on women's spaces. So they sent me an extremely rude email back and blocked me on Twitter. That was only the second time I'd ever been blocked on Twitter. The first time was Owen Jones, and he was very much for saying something similar. And I can't tell you how strange this was, because I'd already been at The Economist for 12 years at that point, and you know, it's an incredibly privileged position to work somewhere like The Economist, because you're asked to write about something, you might not know anything at all about it, but you can pick up the phone to the most important experts in the world on that topic, and you can say, hi, I'm The Economist's whatever correspondent, I'm writing an article on such and such, do you have any time to talk to me about it? And they generally say yes, and they're very pleased if you quote them. And if you say something wrong, like if you've got the language wrong, and you say something that's now an obsolete way of thinking about it, they just tell you, and they do it quite nicely. They don't tell you that you're a bigot or a Nazi and then block you on Twitter, you know. It's such a strange way to behave that was kind of the first thing that really alerted me that was something going on here. So I wrote that article. I don't think it was great, I think it was all right, and I just kept worrying about it. And there wasn't much to read at the time. If you remember back to 2017, there was Fourth Wave Now, there was Transgender Trend, and Lily Maynard had a blog, and Janice Turner was writing about it, Jeannie Bindel was writing about it, it was just a few people. And so you felt very lonely about it. And I kept reading about it, and kept reading about it, and then in 2018 I became genuinely very worried. And what really got me was this article I found, because I kind of up to then I thought they were sort of saying the things they said, like with the fingers crossed behind the back. You know, not really meaning it. Like, they were saying trans women are women, but all of us were kind of understanding, you know, not really women. Like, just you got to say it. But I found this article about how it was lesbians were transphobic if they didn't accept that what they called pre-transition trans women were lesbians. I hope that's not me, because that is how my alarm sounds. And then it came across like it's a light bulb moment. I thought, they really mean it. Holy fuck. And I went to a colleague, and it was Wednesday morning at The Economist, which is the busy day, and I found The Economist, and people were not going to believe what I've just read. And I told him, and he said, no, that can't be the case. That was not happening. You were misunderstood. I said, no, I have not misunderstood. And that's the moment, friends, that we all call going down the rabbit hole. So that was my rabbit hole. I started to think maybe I should write a book about this, but I didn't want to, because I never wanted to write a book. Loads of my colleagues at The Economist wrote books, and it's miserable. And I saw all of them. And also, The Economist gets hundreds and hundreds of books to review a week, and those that aren't reviewed get put in this cupboard and they're taken away every Friday by a charity. But yet we don't look at them beforehand and take them out. And that cupboard was next to my office. So I used to go past it and look at it and think, wow, all the work that went into this. These books are being taken away every week. Do not write a book. So I wasn't a cheery author to be. And then in 2019, I was invited to an event put together by a lesbian collective called Make More Noise in Manchester. And they had said, meet some detransitioners. And it was the usual thing, you know, you don't know where it is until an hour beforehand, and all that stuff. And for the first time I met detransitioners. There were 6 of them at this event. And one of them was just desisted, so she had just wasted her 2 years on absolute nonsense. But the rest of them had all medicalised to some extent, and at least one of them had had all her sex organs removed. So she had her hysterectomy and ovariectomy at 21. And she had been anorexic. She had been very seriously anorexic, as in hospitalised, and her parents told her to prepare for the worst more than once. She was lesbian, and that was part of what led her where she was. She had been quite seriously bullied at school. But anyway, when she was 18, she Googled, and she Googled the phrase, is it possible to get your breasts removed if you don't have breast cancer? Obviously because her teeny tiny breasts were something she wanted to get rid of because of her eating disorder. And a week later she believed she was a trans man. And she found a counsellor, and that counsellor said to her that the reason she was starving herself was because she was really a man. And so her body understood her curves to be wrong, and once she went through all the surgeries and took testosterone, her eating disorder would be cured. And her parents were delighted. They were very supportive because they were actually the people for whom would you rather a dead daughter or a live son. Honestly, they just wanted her to stay alive. So she quickly went on testosterone, and she had her breasts removed, and she would got put on the waiting list or whatever for surgery on her genitals, and she had her hysterectomy, as I said, at 21. Now, I don't know, some people here will have had hysterectomies. My mother had a hysterectomy. It took her a year to recover. So this girl had been told that this was life-saving care and no preparation whatsoever for how terrible she would feel. So she didn't recover quickly. She went online again, and she found support groups for women who have had hysterectomies for endometriosis or cancers of various sorts, and they were lovely. They were great to her and told her it was going to take time. And so she hung out there while she was looking up phalloplasty, and she went and did a consultation on that, but she was getting really worried because that is a gruesome operation. But one day, it just suddenly occurred to her, as she was talking to these people who were supporting her on the subject of her uterus removal, she suddenly thought, why has an operation that can only be performed on a woman meant to turn me into a man? And it was like she'd hit the wall and she bounced all the way back, and she now thought that everything she had done in the previous 4 or 5 years was nonsense. So she sat there with this group and she talked to us, and she was so powerful that she really felt that obviously she had been let down terribly, but also she had been trying to speak as calmly as she could, and she kept saying things like, I promised myself I would not use this word, but I cannot avoid using it. I was castrated. And that day I decided that if I was to call myself a journalist at all, I would try to know this. And I was completely fine with not finding a publisher or any of those things. I had just absolutely priced all of that in. I think I had about 30,000 followers on Twitter at the time, and I thought, oh, you know, I'll self-publish. I know I'm a neat writer. I edit for The Economist, so I can be the last person who sees things, but also my husband's a proofreader. So I will put together a little publishing house and just publish one book. The name would have been Burning Books, and I'm kind of sorry that that never happened. And I would sell it myself. But in fact, I found an agent and a publisher no problem. Kathleen Stock actually suggested her agent to me, which was very kind of her, because it's not normal for agents to take two books that are similar. And I only had one publisher say yes, but one is enough, and they were great. The other ones all said either not in a million years, this is bigotry, or this will sell very well, but not in a million years because young staff. And it went through fine. I didn't actually have any problems. It got reviewed. I got great reviews mostly. And then I thought, the original plan had been that I would give this up, because for me, what the point of the book had been was to write it all down to my satisfaction so that I stopped fretting about it, and then I'd done my bit and I could move on. However, it didn't work out quite like that. It turned out that if you put your head above the parapet on this, people come and tell you desperately sad stories. And also you start to see how badly things are going wrong, and things are just much worse than I thought they were. So I continued at The Economist for a while, but I found that, I just wasn't doing what I wanted to be doing. I had a great job, they were great to me, I was editing the Britain section, fantastic job, but I just wasn't doing what I wanted to do each day, which was to try to make some difference on this. So I asked for a year's leave of absence and joined Sex Matters, and amazingly, looking back, I thought in April 2022 that, by then there were maybe sort of 30 or 40 people who were quite active on this in Britain. I'm just making up a number, but something like that. That I could actually make a genuine difference in a year, and then I could go back to my job. I just had no idea, even after writing the book, how much destruction there had been and how ingrained this idea had become. So I didn't go back to The Economist, I stayed with Sex Matters, and now I work for them part-time and do other things, including freelance journalism. So our approach at Sex Matters is not the only approach that you can take on this. It's the one we decided to do, and some other groups we like do things a bit differently. Our policy positions are incremental. We think that this happened step by step, and we're going to have to undo it step by step. We're very legally focused because the founding idea for Sex Matters was Maya Forstater's case. And our brand is what we like to think of as relentlessly reasonable. So other people are wittier, edgier, kind of sometimes ruder, and sometimes we love what they're doing, but it's just not what we do. We're aiming to be people who are women who are working can feel that we are safe, that we are people that they can trust to talk to politicians, to policymakers, to regulators, and that we are who they would be if they had time to be doing this. And alongside the legal work, we do a lot of policy development, political engagement, and media engagement. So the question that people generally ask, often about a minute before the end of an event, when the person who's running the event says, time for just one more short question. Someone puts their hand up and says, where did all of this come from? Thanks. It did take me nearly the entire book, and I'm still thinking about that now. But anyway, where did this all come from? So I have a lot of answers for that, and we could just talk about that, but I won't. I'll just pick three things. I think it's like a perfect storm. There were a load of things that came together. And one thing is definitely the human rights organisations that needed a new cause. So some people call this George, you needed a new dragon to slay thing. You've done your job. Instead of just going quietly into retirement, you look for something else to fight. So these organisations that had great names and had really high public standing, people like the GLAAD and ACLU in America, or Stonewall in the UK, they got gay marriage. And if you are a campaigning charity, what gets people to donate is those marquee causes. It's much easier to get people to open their wallets for something that's very clearly defined, where it's clear what success means, than to say, look, there's a lot of homophobia in the world, help us to fight it, but that's an ongoing task, it will never be done, we'll just improve. And when gay marriage was won, a whole load of activists went into retirement, and a lot of donors cancelled their standing orders as well. And it was pretty clear that that was going to happen, because we knew we were going to get gay marriage for some years before it happened. So they were looking around for the next thing, and they settled on gender self-ID. Part partly because there's a sort of arc of progress narrative. You know, we did women, we did black people, we did gay people, now we're doing trans people. And that's still how an awful lot of people who are far away from this fight see it. And that's why they think we're bigots. They think that we're trying to pull the ladder up after us. You know, women got their rights, but they don't care about trans people. Gay people got their rights, they don't care about trans people. I think another huge reason is social media. So if you think about the bodily distress or dissociation that leads to a lot of people identifying as trans, that's a sort of thing that historically has been thought of as a psychosomatic illness. And psychosomatic illnesses are very real, they feel very real, but they're shaped by your psyche. And those illnesses get shaped in your culture, often with the help of a doctor, to precisely, you know, in one culture it's schizophrenia or anorexia, in another culture it'll have a different name and somewhat different symptoms. So it's clear that this is that sort of psychogenic illness, and they're very contagious. Because once the idea is out there that this is how you express your bodily dissociation and bodily disease, people will fit that template in the same way that they did with anorexia. So that was hard to spread before we had anything that spread things, and then doctors came along and doctors shaped and spread those diseases. So if you read the history of psychogenic disease, people like Charcot, who was the guy who invented hysteria, and everywhere he worked, there were enormous numbers of hysterics, and then when he died, hysteria kind of died too. I mean, literally. So it was the medical profession that shaped psychogenic diseases. And then the media came along, and newspapers played a big part in it too. Newspapers spread anorexia, which was very much a Northern American disease, to other countries by writing about it. But now we have social media, and social media is the first peer-to-peer, no expert involved way that we spread ideas, including, it turns out, psychogenic diseases. And above all, it's kids who do it. It's the first time in human history that we have had children in spaces where there are no adults bringing each other up. And kids are kind of dumb. They have, you know, they're naive, they're inexperienced. The things that are lovely about them are the same things that are dangerous for them. They pick up new ideas, they're very changeable. They need adults to give them structure and to keep them away from things that are dangerous. But now we have Tumblr, where girls could meet each other at age 13 and tell each other that gender identity is very important. You need to examine yourself and choose your gender out of a list of potentially thousands. Now adults didn't even know. The first time adults knew was when their daughter informed them that she was really their son, or non-binary, or demi-queer, or pansexual, or whatever. But then I'm going to spend a bit more time on this one. I think the third reason, and this is not something I appreciated when I was writing my book, is that this is part of a larger worldview, and it fits in a change over several centuries in the way that we think about humans and human society. And I'm still trying to decide what the best name for it is, because whenever I do this, people criticise me, but that's just part of the course. I'm kind of vacillating between hyper-liberalism and hyper-individualism. So it's the idea that each person has a true self, and knows that true self, and that self-knowledge about your true self, by definition, cannot be wrong. And within that worldview, any notion of a shared human nature or the common good is meaningful only in the way that Judith Butler said gender was. So everyone knows probably that she said that gender is a performance for which is a ritual of which there is no original. Sorry, I forgot to write down the actual quote. Anyway, the point is that she thought gender was only meaningful because it was performed over and over again. There was no there. There was nothing behind it. So in this worldview, that's what human nature is like. Like anything that we think is good or natural or normal, or human flourishing, that's just because we've done it over and over again. So that's why they use this word normative, like heteronormative, cisnormative. What they're saying is, it's just because. There's no reason. But they really mean it for everything. So to these people, anything that it means to be an admirable person, like to be a net positive for the world, to help people rather than to hurt people, that's just, the old-fashioned views are just the way they are for no reason. And now we're wiser, and we know that what makes a person good, or admirable, or positive for the world is a declaratory thing. It means that individual has chosen who they are, tells us about it, it's not for us to judge, and that's the point. and in particular it's the point of your teen years. And that's what they mean when they say they identify as something. They have worked out who they are, they tell us, and that's the job of being a human. So I'm calling this hyperliberalism because if you think about politics as a spectrum, because it really is, unlike some other things, it's a spectrum, say, from liberal to conservative, and most of us are more naturally leaning towards one or the other. So if you are a conservative, you really emphasise the ideas of shared human nature and the common good, and you think that the point of society is to give life to shared ideals, and that's going to mean impositions and restraints on individuals on occasion. And liberals look at another bit of what it is to be a good, happy, flourishing individual, which is the bit about freedoms to make your own decisions and choose for yourself what it is for there to be a good life. They're obviously in tension, and there's obviously a lot to be said for both of them. And if you live in what's called a democratic, liberal, multicultural society, as we're supposed to, then your human rights framework will be an attempt to, a very sophisticated attempt, I should say, to balance both of those and incorporate both of those. So any human rights framework is going to have things in it like, it's good to, you have the right to life, that torture is always bad. Like if you think about it, if there wasn't a shared human nature, there'd be no way we could say those two things. But it would also say things like freedom of belief, freedom of speech, the right to a private life, which are about your own personal things. So I think what's happened is we've pushed out past that spectrum, out on the liberal side, past the respect, the healthy individualism of classical liberalism, which means we understand differences of opinion, and we understand that we need to balance different people's interests, out past that to a place where your true self is something to be discovered by introspection, and that is what is good. And then discrimination, which originally just meant noticing and when necessary acting on difference, is automatically bad. It's such an extreme version of individualism that the idea just of shared human nature looks coercive. And if you think you're something and other people or authorities disagree, then those other people and authorities are not just wrong, they're bigoted, and they're not just bigoted, they're evil. Because the only thing you're an authority on is yourself, and they have no right to tell you anything against what you say about yourself. So objectivity itself becomes victory. It helps me to understand that this is what they think, despite the fact that it's barking, because I always want to know what's going on in the other person's head. But it's very contradictory, and it's impossible to incorporate in the human rights framework, even though they now say that it's a human right to have your gender identity recognised. So the point about the human rights framework is that it's got balancing in it the whole way through, and it also accepts that there are lots of things that aren't human rights that are also important. For example, it is not a human right. There's nothing about human rights in which side of the road you drive on. But we have to pick one and stick to it so that we can live together on this planet without killing each other. So there's a load of stuff that isn't human rights, but it is still constraining us. And then within the human rights framework, there are things that often balance against each other. For example, freedom of speech and privacy. If I speak about you, I may be infringing on your privacy. And if you want to keep things private, you may be stopping me from speaking. And those things hit up against each other all the time in journalism. So it's a framework that the American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes said, within which your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. You often hear them say rights are like pie. Like rights really are pie, big time. More for one person often means less for others. But they're coming out with this idea that they can tell us who they are, and all we are is the audience for that, the people affirming. And that makes all of us people who are putting on one man and one woman plays, or one baby plays, I don't know what, gender-neutral protagonist plays. But we can't all be watching everybody else's plays while we're putting on our plays. And we're not even allowed to be a critic. Like, you're not allowed to say, God, your play's shit. Anything on the I am living as a woman play, God, no. But more broadly, it just wrecks any chance to do balancing exercises. So, I want to give you an example. So, self-ID means that a man who is stripping off in front of naked women in a women-only space and watching them strip off in front of him is doing something right and proper if he identifies as a woman. Those women are validating his identity, so they're doing something very moral as well. And he has the right to have his identity validated, and they don't have the right to withhold that validation. That's the way it looks to them. But the thing is, within the human rights framework, that doesn't just go outside it, it turns it through 180 degrees. Because what I've actually described there is an Article 3 violation. I don't know what number it is on the UN list. It's a different numbering in the European Convention. But Article 3 is the torture, inhuman and degrading treatment one. And that's an absolute right, and states have a positive obligation to uphold your Article 3 rights. And the European Court has already ruled that being forced to undress again in front of someone of the opposite sex is an Article 3 violation. So here we are saying that it's a human right to do something that is actually one of the worst possible human rights violations. 180 degrees. And then if you look at free speech, you know, it is often said that it's the foundational human right, because if you don't have free speech, you can't advocate for your other rights when they're being destroyed. It's a balancing right. Often you constrain free speech, that's fine. But it is foundational, and within gender identity ideology, it is destroyed. And the reason is because it doesn't allow you to speak about something that's completely obvious. Like, any one of us can look around this room and we can tell immediately what sex everybody is. There's no privacy over that. But within gender identity ideology, there is. Because you are the thing you say you are, and people aren't meant to talk about the thing that you actually are. So, you know, one person can be a cis woman, one person can be a trans woman, we're meant to call them both women, and the fact that one of them has a trans history, as they started to say, which they may not wish to share because that's their privacy right, is now something I'm not allowed to talk about. And that's freedom of belief we're damaging there as well, because I just don't believe any of that stuff, but I have to play along. So what we're seeing here is the machinery of the human rights framework harnessed to work against human rights. And that is why it's people like your Human Rights Commission who say the things they do. A couple of weeks ago, the boss of the Human Rights Commission in Australia said that she didn't know what a biological man meant. Or possibly a biological woman. Anyway, if she knows one of them, she knows the other. How is it that it's people in the Human Rights Commissions who are acting like that? And that is because they have brought this idea in that turns the whole system back to front. It's not just a glitch. It's a feature of this belief system that it does that it turns human rights back to front. And then to return to the free speech thing, I started by saying that gender and trans are just linguistic. There's nothing about being trans beyond saying that you are trans, or what your gender identity is. Well, in that case, it's obvious why it requires such ferocious speech policing. It's because if other people don't use your preferred pronouns and don't refer to you as the sex you say you are, and if you're not allowed to use single-sex spaces that align with your gender identity, then there is nothing to your gender identity that's out in the world. It's just words that you're saying or thinking in your head. So other people just have to play along, using the words that you use about yourself and setting aside their rights to affirm yours, and therefore you're going to have to police their speech very hard. That explains why they protest. Like, it looks stupid, like it doesn't look tactical, but there isn't anything else to do. They have to try to silence us. So where does gender medicine fit within all of this? Well, in general, in medicine, the point is that you understand what healthy functioning means. That's the starting point. If somebody's a hip specialist or a heart specialist, they know what hips or hearts do. And that means they know when it's going wrong, like when your heart isn't beating right or your hip is not functioning properly. And they can start to hypothesize about what made it go wrong, what might cure it, what might stop it from going wrong, and what might make it function healthily again. And we always forget that bit when we talk about evidence-based medicine. We start at the whole, does it work? But like, what's it? What is this system meant to do? Why would I even think this thing works? Like, in order to crank up the whole machinery of evidence-based medicine, you have to know what it is that a healthily functioning system, part or body part is, so that you can hypothesize and start doing tests. So that means that gender medicine is just not medicine, because nobody knows what it is to have a healthily functioning gender. I mean, I suppose they would say, well, it means that you're not suffering from gender dysphoria. But dysphoria is just a word for distress. So what they're saying is, there's this thing gender that I'm not telling you what it is, and you're distressed about it. And it's very strange because they also say that there's nothing wrong with being trans, that it's that it's cis heteronormative to think that there's something wrong, or cisnormative to think there's something wrong. It's just an alternative gender identity, which is very odd because people generally decide that they're trans because they're suffering from gender dysphoria. So it's, already we're clearly on a sticky wicket here, but the starting thing is nobody knows what it is to have a healthy gender or gender identity. So nobody knows what it is to have a malfunctioning one. So why would we think we know what might cause it or what might treat it? Saying someone has gender dysphoria is a bit like saying that their humours are out of balance. So this is the ancient Greek theory that we all have four humours flowing within us. And so in case you don't know, the four humours were blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. And this lasted right until the Middle Ages, and the treatments were things like bloodletting and purging. So they would give you things to make you sick or to give you diarrhoea, to bring your humours back in balance. Obviously the treatment is crap because the theory is crap. And I think gender medicine is exactly the same. There's no reason to think the things that they do, like puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or chest or genital surgeries, and then the wilder things like the voice training, the facial feminization, and so on. Like, there's literally no reason to think they'd work, because they haven't told me what was wrong. And you could have done scientific research on the four humours. They haven't got the evidence-based medicine going, but it absolutely could have been the case. Like, try more purging earlier in the day, later in the day, different things to purge, different amounts of blood, and you would generate hypotheses, and you would test them, and you would probably come up with some results, and then you could do more research, because they always say more research is needed. But that would be falling into a trap that Harriet Hall, who was a doctor who died in 2023, and she was a proponent of rationalist medicine, big opponent of quack medicine, she called it tooth fairy science. She said, it's like you imagine you decided that there was a tooth fairy, and it would be great to work out how to maximise the amount of money the tooth fairy left. So she wrote, you can study whether leaving the tooth in a baggie generates more tooth fairy money than leaving it wrapped in Kleenex. You can study the average money left for the first tooth versus to the last tooth. You can correlate tooth fairy proceeds with parental income. You can get reliable data that will be producible, consistent, and statistically significant. You think you've learned something about the tooth fairy, but you haven't. Your data has another explanation, parental behaviour, that you haven't even considered. And this is the one-line quote. You have deceived yourself by trying to do research on something that doesn't exist. So when we start our criticisms of gender medicine with the paucity of evidence, like saying there's no evidence that puberty blockers help, there's no evidence that cross-sex hormones work, we're starting way too far downstream. And also, we're acting like the burden of proof is on us. The burden of proof should be on them. They should have to start by saying what is wrong with the person they are treating and why the sorts of things they are suggesting might work. By taking it all so seriously, we are paying it a compliment it doesn't deserve. And they can research forever. They can try different hormone protocols. They can start the puberty blockers at different ages. They can do different sorts of voice training. They will not run out of hypotheses to test. So our central point has to be there is no reason to do any of this in the first place. I think one of the reasons we don't see this is because it's a really big claim. Because what I'm saying is there's a field of medicine that literally should not even exist. And people would assume that they know what they're talking about because, they're specialists, they're like cardiologists or immunologists, and they're credentialed and they have research journals and clinics and so on. But I think the bigger reason is because they're doing a really good imitation of medicine. So here's the Judith Butler quote without me mangling it. She said, gender is an imitation for which there is no original. And I think that that's very much like what they're doing in gender clinics. They're doing a ritual. It's the ritual of medicine. They're making appointments, they're doing consultations, they're coming up with diagnoses, prescriptions, blood tests, everything, referring patients to other doctors, and they're making claims about outcomes and efficacy. And whenever they interact, this is crucial, whenever they interact with funding bodies, insurers or governments, they're talking like they're doing medicine. But it's all empty. In fact, what it is it's performative, which should make me very happy because the queer theorists do love performativity. But the theme of his performance, to bring me back to this notion of hyper-individualism, the theme of the performance is that each person has a true self and knows their true self and cannot be wrong. What they're in the business of doing is to give an appearance of solidity to a specific sort of declaration of one's true self, namely your gender identity. What they're selling is identity validation. And if you think that that's the sort of thing that gender identity is, the sort of thing that you bring into being by stating it, it's not just gender clinics that have that purpose. It's everything that they would call gendered and that we call single sex. To them, the reason that we have women only and men only spaces, services and sports, is so that feminine identity people can validate their identities by going into the female services, and masculine ones can go and perform their masculinity in the male ones. And it's not even quite that, because there isn't actually any requirement to perform your gender. You just have to state it. The rest of us have to do the work. We have to validate it. So in this, I've come to think that when they open the door marked M or F, what they're doing is they're declaring their gender identity. And there's no role, as I said, for the rest of us except supporting actors and appreciative audience. So you can't say you don't want to join in, you can't say you don't want to watch it, and you can't be a critic and say it's a very bad performance. So you can't say, look, you say you're a woman, or you're living as a woman, or you have a female gender identity, but you do not seem very womanly to me. That's not allowed. And a woman can do the most obviously unmasculine thing a human being can do, namely get pregnant. And she's still living as a man, because all she has to do is say she's living as a man. And a man can do the most unfeminine thing possible, toss up between impregnating someone or raping somebody, and he is still living as a woman, as long as he says he's a woman. And what they would say is, men can get pregnant too, and women can rape too. It's a kind of bait and switch. So they replace the physical reality of biological sex with something called gender identity, which they don't define. But the people who aren't in favour with what they're doing think that it is something concrete. They will say things to you like, oh God, I get so many men emailing me. It is literally always men. It is literally never been a woman who sends me this email. Sex and gender are different. Thanks. But that's what they think. They think that the trans activists understand that there are two sexes, but they think that there are social roles. But they've long ago stopped splitting those two. They don't even think there are social roles. Like some of the things like that, things like it's possible to be womanly, you know, like doing feminine things, knitting, definitely not doing a PhD in mathematics. And those are women. And if a man wants to live like that, then he's a woman. But that is actually a bit objective if you think about it. At least there's something there, sexist and double. But that isn't what they think. But most people who are, you know, unthinkingly supportive of the trans agenda think that is what they are claiming. And they haven't given it much thought. And they also think that it's inherent and it's diagnosable. It's probably a mental health condition. And they think that if we don't play along or treat it, that's very unethical. And I think the people inside the gender ritual know that the supporters outside the gender ritual are misunderstanding what they think. And I think it's deliberate. They know that the judge who sides with a parent, sometimes there are these estranged parents and one parent wants to puberty block, and the judge who sides with the parent who wants to puberty block thinks there's a thing called a trans child, and that's the ethical thing to do. And the same with the social worker who thinks the 13-year-old cross-sex hormones, or the teachers who affirm a child's gender. They all think there's a special sort of person called trans, and that this is the evidence-based treatment for it. And the people inside the system know that all it takes to be that special kind of person is to say, you're that special kind of person. And that all they're doing is responding to that declaration, and they're not promising anything at all about healthier functioning. And when you see that gulf, it makes the fact that they're offering physical interventions monstrous. Because if all they're selling is validation, then why are they giving people drugs and surgeries? Like, why don't they just give out pronoun badges? And I'm really seriously, if trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are valid, it's transphobic to think a woman can't have a penis, then why the fuck are they cutting off the penis? I think they should just send them home and tell them that they're transphobic if they want anything more. I mean, what good gender affirming care mean anyway? All it is to have a gender is to say you have the gender. So they're trying to ride two horses. They're trying to claim that this is medicine, so you have to do medicine-y things. There's something out of alignment and they're bringing it back into alignment. But they're also claiming that people are who they say they are. So why are they doing that? I think it depends on how cynical you want to be. I do think a lot of people inside that system have got lost in the contradictions and they genuinely think they're doing the Well, I'll make 3 observations. So first is that this field of so-called medicine, even compared with other fields of medicine, gives people a lot of power and a lot of self-validation is good and progressive. So you get to rescue suffering children, you help them to be reborn as the selves they were always meant to be, you get to remodel human flesh, and the great bit is that you get to lecture the world about morality while you're at it. So a lot of people who go into medical fields have a saviour complex, and that's all there is in gender medicine. And the second is that there's something very powerfully pagan about it, that the greater the physical sacrifice, the more real the belief. I think it would be quite unsatisfying to just give your pronoun badge and told to toddle off, you know? But if you cut off body parts and you sacrifice your reproductive system and probably shorten your life because of your gender identity, then that's like saying that gender identity is really, really real. Committing irreversibly is a way of saying that you need it. And then the third one, of course, this is a lucrative business. There's an American journalist, Upton Sinclair, is remembered for nothing except one quote, which is, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something, and his salary depends on his not understanding it." And recently, they are abandoning even the pretense of any of the objective stuff. And you'll see this, like they'll say now that they are helping people along their gender journey, and they're helping them to reach their embodiment goals. And that means that you work out your gender, you come in, you tell them what body changes would best help you to, I don't know, reveal that gender to an admiring world. And then those people who have gone through training that for some reason has allowed them to give you powerful carcinogenic drugs or sterilise them or whatever, will do that for you just according to what you want. And any objective criteria at all for when you would do that is called gatekeeping. And because self-definition in this worldview is the highest, in fact the only good, doing this to yourself is extremely moral, and helping other people to do it is moral too. And regret just doesn't even arise as a concept, because it's what matters to you in the moment is important. And if you change your mind in the future, that's all good. You're just gender fluid. You're at a different point in your gender journey. You can't go back to the person who facilitated you cutting off healthy body parts and blame them, because it was your call, they were just affirming you. It's like worse than buyer beware, because it's a total abdication, not just of responsibility, but even the acknowledgement that it is possible to be harmed by pursuing goals that you chose for yourself. So how do we get out of this? As I said, for us at Sex Matters, it's pretty legal. But it's legal, political, media and public opinion. Because judges don't rule in directions that the wider society doesn't agree with. And you see this, for example, with the big tobacco cases and the opioid cases in America. They took cases for ages against the tobacco firms. And it was only when public opinion, partly because of these cases, by the way, it's a circular process, public opinion turned against the idea that it was okay to market people highly carcinogenic and highly addictive products, and then just say, okay, we're killing you, but you chose to do it. And I do think that we've seen that in the UK. We've been taking these sorts of cases now. I think Maya lost her job in 2018, and we're now in 2025, and we've still got cases, and we're going to have cases for years still. So it's at least a decade of cases, and those cases have educated the judiciary, but they've also significantly educated the public, as other things have, not just the legal cases. And that has fed back, and I don't know that we would have got the Supreme Court judgment that we did if we hadn't had those several years of well-reported cases. And if there hadn't been a lot of public opinion polling and examples in the press of things that went wrong because of gender self-ID. So all of those things, legal, political, policy making, media and public opinion, feed into each other. So the legal approach that we've taken, I'm not sure that we knew this was the legal approach we were taking, but looking back, what we did was we focused on 2 areas, and the first of those was freedom of speech and belief. So probably everyone here knows Maya Forstater's case as the CEO of Sex Matters, but just to summarise briefly, she was working in 2018 for the London branch of an American headquartered NGO, Centre for Global Development, and at the time the government was consulting on bringing in gender self-ID, and Maya said she thought it was a bad idea, and she let this be known at work. And nobody in her London office noticed that this was a problem or thought it was a problem. But 3 people in the Washington office did. And they complained. And then, in a fatal mistake, her bosses in London brought in consultants to examine what she had done and said, if you bring in consultants to find transphobia, they will find transphobia. And no witch finder ever went out and found no witches. Again, their salary depends on it. So they reported and said that she had been transphobic and her contract was not renewed. So she decided to take a legal case, and actually she tweeted about it, and some lawyers who are in a collective, an informal collective called Legal Feminist, approached her and said, we'd like to try a belief case. So as we've heard, our Equality Act is like your Human Rights Act, and one of the 9, we have 9 protected characteristics, one of them is called religion or belief. And we'd like to try a gender-critical belief case. So Maya ended up summing up her belief like this, 4 parts. There are 2 sexes, they can't change. It's important to be able to talk about that, especially for women. So all 4 of those together make her gender-critical belief. And notoriously, the judge decided that this was not protected in the workplace. And the criteria for being a belief that is protected, there's several of them, but the important one is the 5th one. It's that it's worthy of respect in a democratic society. And what that means is it's not rights destroying. So what the judge in her first case, her first employment tribunal case, decided was that to believe these 4 things inherently and seriously destroyed other people's rights. Of course, trans people. And that put it on a par with Nazism, because the examples that are given of N-Worriads, as we call it, not Worriads, beliefs are things like that women should have the vote taken away from them, that black people should be re-enslaved, that Jewish people should be sent to gas chambers, things that destroy other people's rights. You are entitled to say those things, but if you say them at work and you're fired for them, you will get no protection in UK law. So her saying those 4 things was treated on par with that. So I was listening to you talking about what it would mean if you lose the Lava case. Well, we lost our Lava case. And I'm dear friends with Maya, and I work with her all the time now, and it was a very bad day. I was one of the people who donated to her case, and so I got the early notice that she had lost before it was out in the media. And I was walking to a party, as it happens, in Westminster, and it was pissing down with rain. And I was walking along, crying in the rain. So pathetic. But then another friend rang me, and the 2 of us just cried on the phone, because she was like, how can this be? Because I was genuinely thinking this is going to impact me at work. Because I've already said all those things, and I've said them in editorial meetings where people disagree with me. Anyway, she appealed, and it was good, because the appeal won, and that set the precedent. So now, any beliefs that are similar enough to Maya's and not manifested in an obnoxious way are things that you can't be fired for in the UK. Of course, people are all the time, but we've had a whole run of cases where we've had wins. So I talked to an employment lawyer a while ago about all of this, and he said it's very like what happened when we brought in the Race Discrimination Act, which meant that you couldn't treat black people differently. You couldn't say, for example, we don't want a black person on the reception desk. So for about 10 years after that came in, cases were taken and won. So the grounds moved. Like at first you'd say, well, you know, I just don't like black people, lose. Then it would be, oh, his colleagues don't like him, I'm not racist, his colleagues are racist, lose. And then it would be our customers, we're fine with a black person, we put them on the reception desk, the customers complain, lose. And at the end of 10 years, people got the point. Employers stopped doing that. I'm not saying there's no racism, of course there is, but there's none of these really easy wins where people turn up at the employment tribunal and directly confess to having committed direct race discrimination in front of the judge. We're in that phase now on gender critical belief because they turn up and they say to us, but they are bigots. Lose. It's great fun. So that started with freedom of belief, and of course freedom of belief is freedom of speech. The first thing they said was you can believe it as long as you never say it. That's literally the first thing that they said after Maya's case, the other side. Manifestation is covered too. You're not allowed to manifest it in an inappropriate manner, but it's fine, you can talk about your beliefs. You can't push them on a colleague who doesn't want to hear them, that's fine. But you can certainly say that what you believe in work. Because the thing is that free speech isn't just about speech, it's advocacy. So a woman doesn't just want to be able to say those 4 things that Maya said, she wants to say And that purpose is often because there's a man who's using the ladies at work. She wants to be able to go to HR and say, there are two sexes, sex can't change. It's important to say that for women's rights, mine, because that person is a man and he's coming to women's toilets, and that is destroying my rights. So gender critical speech is advocacy for sex-based rights. And that's the way the cases are going now. Like, we've moved on from Maya's very theoretical case. She had no trans colleague. There was nothing happening in work. And they just had one gender-neutral toilet. It was a very small office. It's moved on to people like the Darlington nurses and Sandy Peggy, who are saying that they have gender-critical beliefs because they want to get a man out of their changing rooms. So that's the first set of cases that we were taking. And then the second lot is about the meaning of sex. So our law is somewhat different from yours. We have a Gender Recognition Act that's very gate-kept, but it doesn't have that nice saving clause in it. It really seems to change your sex for pretty much all purposes. There's a few purposes it doesn't. Does anyone know? Inheritance. Inheritance of land and titles is the big one. It occurred to them that they would enable eldest daughters of landed gentry to change their sex and disinherit the younger brother. So they specifically ruled that one out. They did rule out a few other things. You can't change your sex for the purpose of sex crimes, because in UK law, rape is specifically penetration, unwanted penetration by penis. So they didn't want to have men saying, but I'm a woman. It's only aggravated sexual assault. And it's also for parenthood. So you can get a gender recognition certificate, but you stay being the parent that you really are if you have a kid. That was 2004, and then in 2010 we pulled together a lot of our anti-discrimination, nearly all of it, law into the Equality Act. So the question was, is the Equality Act one of the things like inheritance, the Gender Recognition Act doesn't change your sex for? Or is it one of the other sorts of rules that it does? And everybody thought it was one of the ones that we do, including our Equality and Human Rights Commission. And the Foreman Scotland case, and I'll skip the sort of previous bits, they were actually fighting for about 7 years over various laws. The case that ended up in the Supreme Court was specifically, does a gender recognition certificate change your sex for the purpose of the protected characteristic of sex? Only about 9,000 gender recognition certificates have ever been given out. So it looks like it doesn't matter. But nobody uses birth certs to get into toilets and single-sex spaces. So what they did was everybody said, well, this man might have a gender recognition certificate, so I have to let him in. And that was the sort of the wedge that opened up what was not a self-ID law and turned it into one. And for about 10 years, lobby groups have been misrepresenting that law, and we have had gender self-ID in practice. So the judgment was fantastic. The Supreme Court, all 5 of the judges ruled, and they did it by looking at the purpose of the Equality Act. And the purpose of the 9 protected characteristics isn't to validate anything, let alone a gender identity. It's to name and give recompense to people who experience discrimination on long-standing reasons that people are discriminated against: race, disability, age, sex, orientation, that sort of thing. Real things. And what they said is that the reason that women are discriminated against is because we are female. It's the irreducible fact of having the sort of body that can get pregnant. Even if an individual woman doesn't, or indeed can't, she is discriminated against as a woman if she is discriminated against because of that biology. And the thing about a GRC, if it moves some men into the women bucket and some women into the men bucket, it creates 2 mixed sex groups. So how can it work? How can it ever be that you compare 2 mixed sex groups and say there's been sex discrimination? And from the point of view of single-sex spaces, they are direct sex discrimination. Every time you put up a sign that says women only or men only, you are committing sex discrimination. So any law against sex discrimination has to include exceptions. Otherwise you would ban everything that's just for one sex. And what the judgment means is that when you put up those signs, it has to be about sex, it can't be about anything else. Because you have to justify the discrimination. It has to be for a purpose, that women don't want to dress in front of men, that only one sex needs this service, like cervical smear tests or whatever. And if you let in even one man, you've proved you didn't need it to be single sex, so now any man can come in. So we now only have 3 options in the UK for any space or service: women only, men only, or mixed sex. It is not lawful to run lots of inclusive women's space. I'm sorry to tell you that most of the people who've been doing it for the last 10 years have not actually registered that fact. So we are having to go back to court to prove to them that what the Supreme Court said actually applies to them. That's mad. I've never seen that happen before. Like if this had been a tax ruling, the next day tax advisors would have gone to the clients. However, it doesn't seem to matter what we think. So you may have heard about the case that we're taking in the Hampstead Ponds, which is a great demonstration case because they're very well known, they're nationally famous. There's a ladies' pond, a men's pond, and a mixed pond, so it's excluded. And the women's pond is designed the way it is because there's a whole load of peeping toms on the Hampstead Heath. So it's got planting all around it. The sightlines are, considered because the changing area and showers people just strip off and someone are outdoors. So you really can't let men in, but they have it. Anyway, we're fighting that one. And the other thing about the way the court did the reasoning is that it'll apply to other laws where sex matters, in particular police searching. So we're taking cases on that too, because we too have got self-ID on strip searching in police custody. I don't know if anyone here has been strip searched. I haven't, but I interviewed people who have. You take off your clothes and you bend over. Imagine that. So it's sort of all over by the crying on the definition of sex in law for us. Not so much yet on the speech. So I said that gender identity is entirely declaratory, and both pronouns and walking through the door marked M and F are ways of declaring your gender identity within their belief system. What the Supreme Court has done is it's taken off the table the walking through the door marked M or F bit. So you can say what you like about yourself, but if you can't live as a woman by walking through the door that's marked F, it's less clear about preferred pronouns. In general, there's no obligation to use them. The police don't seem to realise that. I have a crime reported against my name for calling a man Ham. Any of you who've ever seen, if anyone has seen the video of me and Frida Wallace at the Institute of Economic Affairs, so the bloke in the ripped fishnets, he's very drunk and says things like that, he fucks Turf's husbands in his fetish club. I've been recorded as having committed criminal harassment for calling him a fetishist. But he said he was a fetishist. Anyway, so our police haven't noticed yet. But the thing is that in work, you actually can get your speech quite severely restricted. So think about it. You answer the phone and you say, the firm's name, 1 moment please, have a nice day. At the restaurant you say the food is excellent, and you certainly don't tell people that your boss is a twat. All of these things are lawful restrictions on your speech in the workplace. And a lot of them are just about operational issues. So lots of American companies have got to the point that they're saying they're not allowed to talk about politics in work at all, because they just can't take it. They can't take all the stuff about the Middle East and all the stuff about Trump. And that would be lawful as long as it's not discriminatory. It's a big restriction on speech, but it's not vital on anyone in particular. The question is whether pronoun rules, which do bite harder on gender-critical people, are sufficiently discriminatory that they can be used. We don't know yet. We haven't had the case for. I do think that that's the way that the free speech ones are going to go soon. So what do you learn from all of this? Your laws are a bit different, but I think that the game plan of starting with the freedom of speech and belief stuff and then turning that into being able to advocate without fear for protection of sex-based rights and the definition of sex, I think that's the right way around. It's very tempting to think that you dive in at what got broken, the big thing that got broken, which is often the definition of sex, as is the case in Australia. But it's too dangerous to advocate for it if you can get fired. People won't do things if they can get fired. Nearly nobody can afford to risk their job. And also, as I said, these things happen step by step. I think we have to unwind step by step. There are obviously people who disagree with me, and that's fine. That's completely fine. Lots of people have different ideas. But for example, the people who say that we should start by trying to repeal the Gender Recognition Act, they're very welcome to campaign for that, and I would like to repeal the Gender Recognition Act. But what they aren't taking into account is that none of this was in the Gender Recognition Act anyway. We never had self-ID in law, we had it in practice, and that's what needs to change. And I think every country, every modern liberal democracy has a whole bunch of protections in law for free speech and freedom of belief. They all have obligations on schools to act in children's best interests, and clinicians not to provide harmful treatments. And I know that you've got laws here and in Australia, that infringe on those things. But I think you have to use the bits of your legal system that aren't broken to try to fix the bits that are. That's certainly what we've done. And you are also a signatory to international treaties like CEDAW and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. They don't give you directly implementable rights, but they are things that you can cite. So what's it going to look like when we've won? It's certainly not going to be that we've defeated the idea of gender identity. Nothing goes. You know, we saw the big increase in anorexia because of contagion, but we still have anorexia. And I think we're going to always have anorexia now, or at least for a very long time. It's the same. We're going to have people who think they have gender identities and think they are the opposite sex. But what we can do is limit and constrain the consequences of believing that, both for the believer and for everyone else. And that won't just limit the harm caused by it, it will limit the appeal of believing it or acting on it. So if you think about this, it's the right framework is again the freedom of belief and speech. So a man can say, I'm a woman, and I can say, no, you're not. And neither of us can stop the other. It's a bit like flat earthers. There are still some of them out there. They're wrong, but we can't fire them for it. We don't have to work in aviation because they can't do the job. And then if we think about gender medicine, remember that gender clinics are locations for validating gender identities. What I mean is, they tell the people who come in that you go out into the world and you will be accepted as the gender you say you are. Well, we've taken that off the table now in the UK, pretty much, because you're not going to be able to use spaces with the opposite sex. So whatever it means to go out into the wide world with your lovely new shiny gender identity and live as a woman or live as a man, it doesn't mean doing things that are only for women or only for men. And I don't think they've noticed that yet. And in particular, they haven't noticed it for children. If you think about puberty blockers, the promise of that pathway, that treatment pathway, is if you start on puberty blockers and then you take cross-sex hormones and then do a surgery, you will pass really well. No one will know when you're going into the opposite sex spaces. And that may be true, but I don't see how a clinician can sell it. I don't know how they can say, we will give you this treatment that will enable you to sidestep laws, indeed to break laws, that exist to protect other people's human rights. I don't think that an NHS clinic can offer that. They're still saying they're going to do a puberty blocker trial, but that is one of the arguments we will make in a judicial review, if they try. So what we left, I think it'll be extreme cosmetic medicine. I think it'll be like, I remember reading this article once about this guy who had, got his tongue forked and he cut off his ears and he tattooed his face and eyeballs and he said he was a snake. There was a doctor he found to do that for him. It didn't mean anyone had to treat him as a snake. It didn't give him any new rights.